The moment Claire Bennett saw her ex-husband walking into the ballroom with another woman on his arm, she did the first reckless thing she had done in years. The Wintercrest Foundation Gala glittered above Manhattan like a diamond suspended in the night sky. Crystal chandeliers poured warm gold across the marble floors of the Grand Regent Hotel, while a string quartet played somewhere beneath the soft hum of old money conversations. Women in couture gowns drifted past silver trays of champagne. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed too loudly beside towering windows overlooking Central Park dusted in fresh December snow. Claire stood near the far end of the ballroom, gripping the stem of a champagne flute she had barely touched, her fingers trembling hard enough to rattle the glass. She should never have come. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago in thick cream cardstock embossed with the foundation seal, a reminder of the life she used to belong to before Ethan Cole destroyed it piece by piece. For nearly 10 minutes, she had managed to survive unnoticed among the crowd, hiding behind polite smiles and the illusion that she belonged there. Then the ballroom doors opened. Ethan walked in first, confident, perfectly tailored. The same devastating charm wrapped around him like a custom-made suit. Beside him was a tall blonde woman in a shimmering silver gown with one manicured hand resting possessively on his arm. The woman laughed at something he whispered, tilting her head back like she had already won some invisible competition Claire never agreed to enter. Claire's stomach twisted violently. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. 6 months. 6 months since the divorce papers were finalized, and somehow the sight of him still unraveled her nervous system in seconds. Ethan scanned the ballroom with the easy arrogance of a man who believed every room belonged to him. And then his eyes landed on her. Claire froze. Heat rushed into her face, while every humiliating memory came roaring back at once. The cold silence of their penthouse dinners. The subtle criticisms disguised as concern. The way Ethan could dismantle her confidence with one quiet sentence and still smile afterward like he had done her a favor. Her pulse pounded louder than the orchestra. He was already moving toward her. Panic seized her chest, so suddenly it felt impossible to breathe. She turned blindly through the crowd searching for somewhere to disappear, somewhere to hide before Ethan reached her. But everywhere she looked were polished strangers and glittering mirrors reflecting her fear back at her. Then she saw him. A man standing alone near the champagne tower, broad shoulders wrapped in a perfectly fitted black tuxedo, one hand resting calmly in his pocket, while the other held a crystal glass untouched. Dark hair, sharp jawline, quiet eyes that looked entirely detached from the performance around him. He looked dangerous in the way winter storms look dangerous. Silent, controlled. Claire didn't think. She moved. Before her courage could fail, she crossed the marble floor, stepped directly into the stranger's space, and wrapped both arms around him. The scent of cedarwood and clean linen filled her lungs. Solid warmth met her instantly beneath the expensive fabric of his jacket. For one horrifying second, she realized what she had done. Her entire body locked with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she whispered shakily against his shoulder. "Please, just pretend you know me." The stranger didn't move, didn't stiffen, didn't pull away. Instead, after the briefest pause, one strong hand settled gently against the small of her back. Protective, certain, as if this had always been exactly where she belonged. Claire's heartbeat stumbled. Behind her, she heard Ethan stop walking. The stranger's hand remained steady against Claire's back as Ethan stopped only a few feet away. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to blur into gold light and muffled violin music while her pulse thundered in her ears. She could still feel the heat of the stranger's chest beneath her cheek, calm and solid in a way nothing in her life had felt for a very long time. "Claire." Ethan's voice carried the same polished disbelief that used to make her question her own reality. She slowly lifted her head from the stranger's shoulder and turned. Ethan stood there frozen beside his fiancée, his confident expression slipping just enough to reveal surprise underneath. His gaze dropped briefly to the stranger's hand on Claire's waist before returning to her face. Claire forced herself to breathe evenly. "Ethan," she said quietly. The blonde beside him studied Claire with open curiosity, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light every time she moved. She was beautiful in the sharp, expensive way magazine covers taught women to become. Claire instantly hated herself for making the comparison at all. Ethan recovered quickly, smoothing his expression into that familiar, charming smile that had once convinced investors, reporters, and eventually Claire herself that he was incapable of cruelty. "I did not expect to see you here tonight," he said. "You disappeared on everyone." There it was, the subtle accusation hidden beneath concern. Claire felt her shoulders tense automatically. Beside her, the stranger's thumb brushed once against the fabric at her waist, barely noticeable, but enough to ground her before panic swallowed her whole. Ethan's eyes flicked toward him again. "And you are?" Before Claire could invent an answer, the stranger spoke for the first time. His voice was low and even, smooth as dark bourbon poured over ice. "A friend." That was all. 2 words. Calm. Controlled. Yet something about the way he said them caused Ethan's posture to shift almost imperceptibly. Claire noticed it immediately. Ethan had always been skilled at reading power in a room. The stranger did not smile, did not offer his name, did not reach for a handshake. And somehow that unsettled Ethan more than arrogance ever could. The blonde fiancée tilted her head. "Funny," she said lightly. "Nobody seems to know who he is." The stranger finally looked at her. His expression remained perfectly neutral, but Claire caught the sudden silence that spread between them like a cold draft moving through the ballroom. "That is usually intentional," he replied. Ethan let out a short laugh that sounded too forced. Well, Claire always did enjoy mysteries. The sentence landed exactly the way he intended. A reminder. A dismissal disguised as humor. Years ago she would have laughed nervously just to keep the peace. Tonight, she only tightened her fingers around the champagne glass. "And you always enjoyed an audience," she answered softly. Ethan's jaw shifted. Just slightly. Claire almost could not believe she had said it aloud. The stranger beside her remained completely still, but she felt the quiet approval in the protective way he angled his body between her and Ethan without making the movement obvious. The orchestra changed songs somewhere behind them. Waiters drifted past carrying silver trays of champagne beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Yet Claire could feel only the unbearable tension standing inches away from the man who had once controlled every fragile corner of her self-worth. Ethan smiled again, colder this time. "I hope life is treating you well, Claire." She recognized the trap immediately. If she answered honestly, he would hear weakness. If she defended herself, he would hear bitterness. But before she could respond, the stranger spoke again. "She seems perfectly happy." Ethan looked at him carefully now. Really looked at him. Claire saw the exact moment discomfort flickered behind Ethan's eyes. Because the stranger did not sound jealous. He did not sound defensive. He sounded certain. The kind of certainty money could not buy and power could not imitate. Ethan glanced once more at the hand resting calmly against Claire's waist. Then his expression hardened almost invisibly. "Enjoy your evening," he said finally. But his attention never fully left the stranger. As Ethan and his fiancée disappeared back into the glittering crowd, Claire released a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her knees suddenly felt weak beneath the weight of adrenaline. Slowly she stepped back, creating distance between herself and the man she had practically attacked 5 minutes earlier. Embarrassment rushed through her instantly. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I do not even know your name." For the first time that night, the stranger's expression softened just enough to become dangerous in an entirely different way. "Sebastian," he said quietly. "Sebastian Hale." Claire repeated the name silently in her head, as though it should mean something to her. Sebastian Hale. The ballroom around them continued glittering with careless wealth and soft orchestral music, but there was a strange stillness surrounding him now that she noticed only after Ethan had walked away. People looked at Sebastian differently. Not openly. Never obvious enough to appear rude. But she caught the subtle shifts. A gray-haired man near the bar straightened the moment he noticed him. A woman in emerald silk paused mid-conversation before quietly guiding her husband in the opposite direction. Even the waitstaff seemed to move more carefully around him. Claire suddenly became painfully aware that her hands had been wrapped around a complete stranger less than 2 minutes earlier. Heat flooded her cheeks. "I really am sorry," she said quickly, smoothing a strand of blonde hair behind her ear with unsteady fingers. "That was incredibly inappropriate." Sebastian regarded her calmly, his dark eyes unreadable beneath the golden chandelier light. "You were trying to escape." It was not phrased as a question. Claire let out a soft breath she almost mistook for a laugh. Was it that obvious? Only to someone paying attention. The answer unsettled her in ways she could not explain. Ethan had spent years noticing only the things that disappointed him. He noticed wrinkles in tablecloths, forgotten emails, dresses he considered too plain, smiles he thought looked forced. But fear, exhaustion, loneliness, those things had always remained invisible to him. Yet this man had recognized panic instantly from across a crowded ballroom. Claire tightened her grip around the champagne flute. "Well," she said quietly, "thank you for helping me anyway." Sebastian glanced toward the crowd where Ethan had disappeared with his fiancée. "Does he always speak to you like that?" The question struck harder than she expected. Claire looked down at the pale gold liquid trembling faintly inside her glass. For a second, she considered giving the automatic answer. "It is complicated. It is nothing. You misunderstood." Years of marriage had trained her to minimize every wound before anyone else could see it clearly. But something about Sebastian's voice made lying feel exhausting. "Not anymore," she answered softly. A faint crease appeared between his brows. "That is not what I asked." Claire looked up too quickly, caught off guard by the quiet precision in his words. Sebastian did not sound angry. If anything, he sounded controlled in a way that felt infinitely more dangerous than shouting ever could. She swallowed carefully. "We are divorced. And yet you looked terrified the moment you saw him." Her throat tightened. Around them, the orchestra drifted into another slow arrangement, while snow began falling harder outside the towering windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. The city lights blurred beneath the storm like watercolor smudged across black glass. Claire suddenly felt exhausted down to her bones. "Some people," she said after a long pause, "do not stop affecting you just because the paperwork is signed." Sebastian studied her quietly. Not with pity, not with curiosity, simply with attention. It was strangely unbearable. Claire looked away first. Across the ballroom, she spotted Ethan watching them from beside the staircase. His fiancée was speaking animatedly to another couple, oblivious to the cold focus fixed entirely on Claire and Sebastian. Even from 50 feet away, she recognized the expression in Ethan's eyes. Calculation. He was trying to understand the man standing beside her, trying to measure him. Sebastian followed her line of sight without moving his head. "He does not like uncertainty," he observed. Claire blinked. "You figured that out already?" "Men like him always need to be the most important person in the room." Claire let out a soft breath. "You say that like you have met many men like Ethan." A shadow crossed Sebastian's face so quickly she almost imagined it. "I have." Before Claire could respond, a sharply dressed older man approached them from across the ballroom, his silver cufflinks glinting beneath the chandeliers. The moment he reached Sebastian, his posture shifted subtly into something close to respect. "Mr. Hale," the man said carefully. "The mayor just arrived. They are waiting upstairs." Claire felt the air leave her lungs. "Mr. Hale." The name landed. Differently now. Heavy. Important. Sebastian's expression did not change, but his attention returned fully to Claire. "Will you be all right?" he asked. The question was simple, yet no one had asked her that in a very long time. Claire stared at Sebastian for a moment, caught completely off guard by the question. "Will you be all right?" The word should have sounded ordinary, polite, casual. Yet something inside her chest tightened painfully because she could not remember the last time someone had asked without expecting something in return. Ethan used to ask if she was all right only when her emotions inconvenienced him. Friends had stopped asking altogether after the divorce, uncomfortable with grief that lingered too long in elegant rooms. But Sebastian asked the question quietly, as if the answer genuinely mattered. Claire forced herself to nod. "Yes," she said softly. "I think so." Sebastian studied her for another second, as though deciding whether he believed her. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and removed a simple black business card. No gold embossing, no flashy title, just a name and a phone number printed in clean silver lettering. "Sebastian Hale." He held it out to her. "In case you ever need another escape plan." Claire stared at the card before carefully taking it. Their fingers brushed briefly and warmth shot unexpectedly through her chest. Ridiculous. She had known this man for less than 15 minutes. Yet standing beside him felt strangely safer than 7 years of marriage ever had. The older man beside Sebastian shifted impatiently. "Mr. Hale," he reminded quietly. "They are waiting." Sebastian finally glanced toward the grand staircase leading to the upper-level ballroom suites. For the first time all evening, Claire noticed the subtle tension surrounding him. Not nervousness. Expectation. Important people were waiting upstairs for him. Powerful people. Suddenly, every strange glance she had noticed throughout the evening made sense. Claire looked back down at the card in her hand. Hale. The name tugged at something buried in her memory. Finance magazines. Business headlines. Private aviation. Something enormous and impossibly far removed from her life now. Before she could place it fully, Sebastian looked back at her. You should not let him ruin your evening, he said. Claire almost laughed at the impossibility of that. I am trying. No, Sebastian replied calmly. You are surviving. That is different. The words landed softly but directly against every exhausted part of her. Surviving. Yes, that was exactly what the last 6 months had been. Surviving the silence of her apartment after Ethan moved out. Surviving the humiliating whispers buried beneath polite sympathy at charity lunches and gallery openings. Surviving mornings where she stared at her reflection wondering when she had become a woman who apologized for existing too loudly. Sebastian gave a slight nod toward her untouched champagne glass. Drink some water before you leave. Claire blinked, startled again by the quiet attentiveness in the statement. He noticed everything. The trembling hands. The shallow breathing. The fact that she had barely touched her drink. It should not have mattered. Yet it did. More than she wanted it to. The older man stepped forward again. The mayor does not wait for anyone, Sebastian. Claire caught the smallest flicker of irritation cross Sebastian's face before it disappeared completely. Apparently he does tonight, Sebastian replied dryly. The older man nearly choked on his own breath, while Claire stared at Sebastian in disbelief. There it was. The first glimpse of humor beneath all that calm control. Unexpectedly warm. Unexpectedly human. Sebastian turned back toward her one final time. Go home, Claire. Her name sounded different in his voice. Softer somehow. Careful. Get some rest. Then, before she could think of anything intelligent to say, he walked away. The older man hurried after him while guests instinctively shifted aside to clear a path through the ballroom crowd. Claire watched him disappear toward the private staircase above the gala floor, tall and composed beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Conversations hushed subtly as he passed. People noticed him. Important people. Powerful people. And somehow he had spent the last 20 minutes pretending to be the boyfriend of a panicking woman he had never met. Claire exhaled shakily and looked back down at the black card resting in her hand. Sebastian Hale. Suddenly her stomach dropped. She knew exactly who he was. Hale International. Billionaire owner of one of the largest private aviation and technology empires in the country. A man so notoriously private that magazines called him the ghost billionaire of Manhattan. Claire's pulse stumbled violently. Somewhere across the ballroom, Ethan was still watching her. Claire left the gala 20 minutes later with snow gathering along the shoulders of her wool coat, and Sebastian Hale's business card still clenched tightly in her hand. Manhattan glowed silver beneath the storm, taxis sliding through wet streets while cold wind curled between the skyscrapers like a living thing. The doorman opened the hotel door for her, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still upstairs in that ballroom, replaying every second beside Sebastian with dangerous clarity. The calm in his voice, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the way Ethan had looked unsettled for the first time in years. Claire stepped into the back of a yellow cab and gave the driver her address in the Upper West Side before sinking against the seat with a shaky exhale. Her reflection stared back faintly from the rain-streaked window. Blonde hair slightly undone. Blue eyes tired beneath the soft glow of passing streetlights. For a moment, she looked exactly like the woman she had been at 28 when she married Ethan Cole. Polished. Pretty. Exhausted. The thought made her chest ache. Ethan used to love telling people how lucky he was to have married someone so effortless. What he really meant was manageable. Claire had spent 7 years becoming smaller for him. Softer. Quieter. Easier to control. At first it had happened so slowly she barely noticed. A comment about a dress being too bright for a corporate dinner. A suggestion that her freelance illustration work was cute, but unrealistic beside his growing legal career. A laugh whenever she became emotional during arguments. By the time she realized she had abandoned nearly every part of herself, Ethan had already convinced her it was maturity. Sacrifice. Love. Claire closed her eyes briefly as the cab rolled through Columbus Circle, glowing with Christmas lights and towering silver decorations. 6 months ago, she had stood in the penthouse kitchen holding divorce papers while Ethan calmly explained that they had grown in different directions. 3 weeks later, society pages photographed him vacationing in St. Bart's with his new fiancée. Claire remembered staring at those photos alone in her apartment, while humiliation burned through her chest like acid. Not because he had moved on, but because part of her still wondered whether he had been right about her all along. Weak, forgettable, replaceable. Tonight should have proven him right. She had practically thrown herself into a stranger's arms out of panic. Yet somehow the memory did not fill her with shame. It filled her with confusion. Sebastian Hale had looked at her more carefully in 20 minutes than Ethan had in years. The cab stopped outside her apartment building just after 11. Claire paid the driver and hurried through the snow toward the old brownstone tucked between a bakery and a bookstore cafe, closed for the night. Her apartment was small compared to the penthouse she used to live in, but it felt warm in ways that place never had. Soft lamps, stacks of art books, half-finished watercolor sketches spread across the dining table beside mugs of cold tea. Home. Claire kicked off her heels near the door and exhaled slowly into the quiet. For the first time all evening, the adrenaline finally began leaving her body, replaced by deep exhaustion. She crossed to the kitchen counter and placed Sebastian's business card beside a ceramic bowl filled with paintbrushes. The silver lettering caught the warm apartment light. Sebastian Hale, billionaire, aviation empire owner, one of the most private men in New York. Claire laughed softly under her breath, the sound almost disbelieving. Of course, she murmured to herself. Somewhere between panic and survival, she had managed to hug one of the richest men in America. Her phone buzzed suddenly across the counter. Claire flinched before picking it up. Ethan. Her stomach tightened instantly. One unread message glowed across the screen. I think we should talk. Claire stared at the words while snow drifted quietly outside her apartment windows. Then, without answering, she turned the phone face down beside Sebastian's card. Claire did not answer Ethan's message that night. She left the phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood alone beside the apartment window, watching snow settle over Manhattan rooftops in soft white silence. Somewhere downtown, the gala was probably still glowing with champagne and polished laughter. Ethan was likely charming investors beside his fiancée while pretending the sight of Sebastian Hale had not rattled him. But Claire knew him too well. Ethan never liked variables he could not control, and Sebastian Hale was the kind of variable men like Ethan feared most. Sleep came slowly. When it finally did, it carried old memories with it. Claire met Ethan Cole when she was 26 years old and still believed confidence sounded like love. He had walked into a small gallery opening in Soho where her watercolor illustrations were displayed beside local artists twice her age. Ethan arrived late in a charcoal suit fresh from a law conference downtown, carrying the sharp, polished energy of someone accustomed to winning rooms the moment he entered them. He bought the first painting she ever sold publicly. 2 days later, he sent white roses to her apartment with a handwritten note that read, "The world deserves to know your talent." At the time, it felt romantic. Looking back now, Claire realized Ethan had always spoken in ways that sounded beautiful while quietly placing himself at the center of everything. Their relationship moved fast. Ethan introduced her to rooftop dinners, private clubs, Hamptons weekends, and charity galas where everyone knew his name. Claire had grown up in Connecticut with a middle-class family that believed handwritten thank you cards mattered more than designer handbags. Ethan's world dazzled her at first. Marble penthouses, black cars waiting outside restaurants, summers in Nantucket with clients who discussed million-dollar mergers over lobster dinners beside the ocean. Ethan loved bringing Claire everywhere because people adored her instantly. She was soft where he was sharp, warm where he was calculating. "You make me look human," he once joked at a dinner party while everyone laughed. Claire laughed too. She did not understand then that the comment had not entirely been a joke. The changes came quietly after the wedding. Ethan never shouted, never slammed doors. His damage lived in smaller things, more elegant things. He would glance at one of her paintings and say, "It is pretty, but maybe a little amateur for the penthouse." He would skim her illustrations for children's books and gently suggest she stop wasting time on small projects, now that his career was accelerating. He always sounded reasonable, concerned, loving. By the third year of marriage, Claire painted less and less. Ethan said they needed to appear polished socially, sophisticated, serious. So Claire reshaped herself to fit beside him like a carefully selected accessory. Softer colors, quieter opinions, fewer emotions. Every compromise seemed tiny in isolation. Together, they hollowed her out slowly enough that she barely noticed it happening. Ethan became a partner at his law firm at 34. Their lives grew even more public after that. Magazine features, charity boards, expensive vacations photographed by society blogs. People constantly told Claire how lucky she was. "You have the perfect life," women whispered at events while staring around the penthouse with envy. Claire used to smile automatically whenever she heard it. Perfect life, perfect husband, perfect marriage. No one saw her crying quietly in marble bathrooms after Ethan criticized her appearance before events. No one heard him sigh with disappointment whenever she became anxious in social settings. "You are too sensitive, Claire," he would murmur with exhausted patience, as if her feelings were a flaw he had been burdened with managing. The affair itself almost felt inevitable by the time she discovered it. Ethan had already spent years treating emotional distance like sophistication. Claire found out 6 months before the divorce when she noticed unfamiliar perfume lingering on one of his cashmere coats after a business trip to Chicago. When she confronted him, Ethan stared at her with cold disbelief. "You are imagining problems because you have nothing meaningful to focus on anymore." The sentence destroyed her more thoroughly than the affair ever could. Claire spent the next morning trying not to think about Sebastian Hale. It was impossible. His voice lingered in her head while she stood behind the counter of Bellamy books, arranging hardcovers beneath warm amber lights, and the scent of fresh espresso drifting from the cafe next door. Snow still covered the sidewalks outside, turning the Upper West Side quiet and silver beneath the December sky. Bellamy Books had become Claire's refuge after the divorce. The small independent bookstore sat tucked between a florist and an old jazz bar that only opened after sunset. There were creaking wooden floors, overstuffed armchairs near the windows, and handwritten staff recommendations taped beneath shelves by people who genuinely loved stories. Nothing about it resembled Ethan's world of polished marble and strategic conversations. That was precisely why Claire loved it. "You look like someone whose brain has not stopped screaming since yesterday." Claire glanced up to find Nora Bennett leaning against the counter, holding 2 paper coffee cups. Nora owned the bookstore and had been Claire's closest friend since college. With dark curls, sharp humor, and a terrifying ability to detect emotional disasters before Claire admitted they existed, Nora had practically carried her through the divorce. Claire accepted the coffee with a tired smile. "Is it that obvious? You alphabetized the mystery section twice this morning." Claire winced softly. "Right." Nora narrowed her eyes immediately. "Okay, start talking." Claire hesitated before pulling Sebastian's black business card from her coat pocket and sliding it across the counter. Nora looked down casually at first. Then her expression changed completely. "Absolutely not." Claire blinked. "What?" Nora looked back and forth between Claire and the card like she was trying to solve an impossible equation. "Claire Bennett," she whispered dramatically. "Why do you have Sebastian Hale's personal business card?" Hearing his name spoken aloud again sent an unfamiliar warmth through Claire's chest. She ignored it immediately. "It is not what you think." Nora stared at her. "I literally do not know what to think." Claire exhaled and quietly told her everything. The gala, Ethan, the panic, the hug, Sebastian pretending to know her. By the time she finished, Nora was leaning against the counter with both hands pressed over her mouth in disbelief. "You hugged a billionaire stranger like he was a human panic button?" Claire buried her face briefly in her hands. "Please stop saying it out loud." "No, I absolutely will not stop saying it out loud because this is the most insane thing that has ever happened to you." Despite herself, Claire laughed softly for the first time in days. The sound surprised her. Nora's expression softened immediately. "Hey," she said gently. "You okay?" Claire looked down at the coffee warming her hands. "I do not know." And that was the truth. Something about last night had unsettled emotions she had spent months trying to lock away neatly. Ethan's message still sat unanswered on her phone. Sebastian's calm voice still echoed through her thoughts. "You are surviving. That is different." Claire swallowed carefully. "It was strange," she admitted quietly. "Being around someone who did not make me feel like I was constantly failing some invisible test." Nora became very still. That is because decent men do not do that, Claire. The words landed heavily. Claire nodded once, but said nothing. The bell above the bookstore door suddenly chimed softly as someone stepped inside from the snowy street. Cold winter air drifted through the shop, carrying the scent of snow and cedar. Claire looked up automatically toward the entrance and forgot how to breathe for a second. Sebastian Hale stood just inside the doorway, wearing a dark wool coat dusted lightly with snowflakes. One hand tucked into his pocket, while his sharp gray eyes scanned the bookstore quietly. The entire room seemed to pause around him. Nora's eyes widened beside Claire. "Oh my God," she whispered. "The panic button is back." Claire stared at Sebastian, standing near the entrance of Bellamy Books while snow melted slowly against the shoulders of his dark coat. For one disorienting second, she genuinely wondered if she had imagined him the night before and somehow pulled him into reality through sheer emotional exhaustion. But no one could hallucinate a presence like Sebastian Hale. Even inside the cozy warmth of the bookstore, he carried that same quiet gravity that seemed to shift the atmosphere around him without effort. Nora looked between Claire and Sebastian with open fascination. "You did not mention he looked like that in daylight," she whispered under her breath. Claire elbowed her lightly without taking her eyes off him. Sebastian spotted Claire almost immediately. His expression remained composed, but something softened subtly in his gaze as he crossed the bookstore toward the counter. No security detail, no assistants, no dramatic billionaire entrance. Just a man walking carefully through narrow aisles lined with novels and poetry collections while soft jazz played overhead from old ceiling speakers. "You listened," Claire said before she could stop herself. One dark brow lifted slightly. "About what?" "The water." A faint hint of amusement touched his mouth. "You look more rested today." Claire hated how much she noticed tiny changes in his expression already. Beside her, Nora suddenly straightened professionally. "Welcome to Bellamy Books," she announced with exaggerated innocence. "Can we help you find something?" Sebastian glanced briefly toward the shelves before looking back at Claire. "Actually, yes." His voice remained calm and low enough that Claire instantly became hyper-aware of how close he stood to the counter. "I was hoping for a recommendation." Nora immediately looked delighted. "Oh, she is dangerous with recommendations. She will emotionally ruin your life with literary precision." Claire shot her a warning look while Sebastian's gaze drifted back toward her with unmistakable curiosity. "Is that true?" Claire folded her arms lightly, trying to ignore the warmth creeping into her cheeks. "Only if someone deserves it." For the first time, Sebastian smiled fully. It was small, brief, but devastating enough that Claire momentarily forgot every intelligent thought in her head. He looked younger when he smiled, less untouchable. Nora visibly pressed her lips together to stop herself from reacting. "Well," Sebastian said softly, "what would you recommend for someone trying to understand why people stay in places that make them unhappy?" Claire blinked slowly. The question settled between them with surprising weight. She studied him carefully now. The expensive coat, the controlled posture, the exhaustion hidden deep behind sharp gray eyes. Suddenly, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man carrying something heavy in silence. Claire glanced toward the fiction shelves before stepping out from behind the counter. "Come with me." Nora watched them disappear into the aisles with an expression that practically vibrated with disbelief. Claire led Sebastian toward the quieter back corner of the bookstore where soft amber lamps glowed above shelves filled with literary fiction and memoirs. Outside the front windows, snow continued drifting steadily onto Broadway, while pedestrians hurried past wrapped in scarves and winter coats. "Most people think unhappiness has to look dramatic," Claire said quietly while scanning the shelves. "But usually it is quieter than that. It becomes routine, familiar." Sebastian watched her carefully, and familiarity becomes difficult to leave. Claire glanced at him over her shoulder. "Exactly." For a second, neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely easy, not awkward, just calm. Claire finally pulled a hardcover novel from the shelf and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed again briefly. Warmth flashed unexpectedly through her chest. Sebastian looked down at the book before reading the title quietly. "The Remains of the Day." "It is about dignity," Claire explained softly, "and regret, and all the things people convince themselves to live without." Sebastian looked back up at her slowly. The intensity in his gaze made her pulse stumble again. "That sounds dangerous." Claire smiled faintly. The best books usually are. Somewhere near the front counter, the bookstore bell chimed again as more customers entered from the cold. But neither of them moved immediately. And for the first time in months, Claire realized she was standing beside a man without feeling like she needed to become smaller to deserve the space. Over the next 2 weeks, Sebastian Hale became an unexpected presence woven quietly into Claire's life. Never overwhelming, never intrusive. He would appear at Bellamy Books on snowy afternoons wearing dark wool coats that smelled faintly of cedar and winter air, always leaving with another recommendation tucked beneath his arm. Sometimes he stayed 10 minutes, sometimes an hour, and somehow, without Claire fully realizing when it happened, she stopped bracing herself every time he walked through the door. It unsettled her how easy he was to be around. Sebastian never filled silence just to dominate it the way Ethan used to. He listened carefully when Claire spoke, as though her thoughts carried actual weight. The first time she mentioned missing watercolor painting, Sebastian asked what she used to paint instead of asking why she stopped. The distinction alone nearly broke her heart. One Thursday evening after closing, snow fell heavily enough to blur the city outside into soft white shadows. Nora had already left for dinner plans while Claire stayed behind reorganizing a stack of used novels near the front window. Sebastian sat quietly in one of the armchairs by the poetry section reading the book she had recommended him days earlier. The bookstore glowed warm around them beneath hanging amber lights while old jazz drifted softly through hidden speakers overhead. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. Yet the silence felt peaceful rather than empty. Claire finally glanced up from the stack of books in her arms. "You are a very strange billionaire." Sebastian looked up slowly from the novel resting open in his hands. "That sounds concerning. Most billionaires probably do not spend Thursday nights reading literary fiction inside independent bookstores." A faint trace of amusement touched his face. "Most billionaires are exhausting." Claire laughed softly before she could stop herself. The sound lingered warmly in the quiet bookstore. Sebastian watched her for a second too long afterward, something unreadable passing behind his gray eyes. Claire's chest tightened unexpectedly. She looked away first. "So," she said carefully, placing another book onto the shelf, "why are you really here?" Sebastian closed the novel slowly. "You already know why I came the first time." Claire nodded. "To make sure I survived the gala." And after that, his gaze remained fixed on her now, calm and impossible to avoid. "After that," he said quietly, "I became curious." Claire swallowed lightly. "About what?" Sebastian leaned back slightly in the armchair, studying her with the same unnerving attentiveness he always carried. "About a woman who looked terrified in a ballroom full of powerful people, but still managed to defend herself with more grace than most of them combined." Claire's breath caught somewhere beneath her ribs. Ethan used to compliment her beauty because beauty reflected well on him socially. Sebastian noticed courage she did not even know she still possessed. The difference felt dangerous. "You barely know me," she whispered. "Not yet." The words settled heavily into the warm bookstore air between them. Claire looked down quickly at the hardcover novel in her hands, suddenly unable to meet his eyes for too long. Her pulse had started doing unfamiliar things around this man, and she hated how aware of it she had become. Before she could gather herself, the bell above the bookstore door chimed sharply. Cold wind rushed inside, carrying snowflakes across the wooden floorboards. Claire looked up automatically toward the entrance. Ethan Cole stepped into the bookstore wearing a charcoal overcoat dusted with snow, his expression tightening instantly the moment he saw Sebastian sitting comfortably beside the poetry shelves. The warmth vanished from Claire's body so quickly it felt physical. Ethan's gaze moved slowly between them, taking in the closed bookstore, the quiet intimacy of the scene, and the unreadable calm written across Sebastian's face. Claire's stomach twisted hard. Sebastian, however, did not move at all. He simply closed the novel carefully and stood. And somehow that calmness frightened Ethan more than anger ever could. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Snow drifted softly outside the bookstore windows while the warm yellow lights inside Bellamy Books suddenly felt too bright against the tension tightening the room. Claire stood frozen near the fiction shelves with a hardcover novel still pressed against her chest. Ethan remained near the entrance, one leather-gloved hand still resting on the door handle as his eyes locked onto Sebastian. Claire recognized that look instantly. Ethan was assessing him the same way he assessed opposing attorneys in courtrooms and competitors at charity galas. Calculating value, measuring status, looking for weakness, and finding none. Sebastian stood beside the armchair with one hand resting loosely in the pocket of his dark slacks, composed as ever. He did not seem irritated by Ethan's interruption. If anything, he looked mildly bored. Somehow that unnerved Ethan more. Ethan finally forced a tight smile onto his face. I did not realize Bellamy Books stayed open this late. Claire knew exactly what he was doing. Pretending casualness. Establishing control. Making the situation seem harmless while probing for information underneath every sentence. We were closing, Claire answered quietly. Ethan's gaze shifted toward her immediately. You have not answered my messages. Her stomach tightened. Sebastian remained silent, but Claire felt his attention sharpen slightly beside her. Ethan stepped farther into the bookstore, brushing melted snow from his coat sleeve with polished irritation. I wanted to make sure you were all right after the gala. Claire almost laughed at the hypocrisy of it. Months of silence after the divorce. Yet suddenly Ethan was concerned about her well-being now that Sebastian Hale had entered the picture. I am fine, she replied carefully. Ethan studied her face for a long moment. You do not seem fine. There it was again. That soft manipulative tone that used to dismantle her confidence molecule by molecule. Concern sharpened into quiet control. But before Claire could respond, Sebastian spoke calmly from beside her. She seems perfectly capable of deciding that herself. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. The bookstore suddenly felt very small. Claire looked toward Sebastian instinctively. He had not raised his voice, had not stepped forward aggressively. Yet the shift in power inside the room was unmistakable. Ethan noticed it too. This is between me and my ex-wife, Ethan said coolly. Sebastian's expression did not change. Then perhaps you should stop discussing it in front of strangers. Ethan stared at him carefully now. Really stared. Claire could almost see the moment realization began forming behind Ethan's eyes. Not full recognition yet, but suspicion. Sebastian Hale was not behaving like someone impressed by wealth or intimidated by influence. He behaved like a man entirely accustomed to both. Ethan folded his arms slowly. Do we know each other? Sebastian met his gaze evenly. No. The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it somehow deepened the tension. Ethan looked back toward Claire again, and this time something colder entered his expression. You move on quickly. Claire felt the old instinctive guilt rise automatically before she crushed it down hard. Move on. As though Ethan had not paraded a new fiancée across Manhattan society pages weeks after their divorce finalized. Sebastian glanced toward Claire briefly, reading the flicker of hurt she could not completely hide. When he spoke again, his voice became noticeably quieter, more dangerous because of it. I think your concern would sound more convincing if you had earned the right to it. Silence dropped heavily through the bookstore. Ethan's eyes narrowed immediately. Claire stopped breathing for a second. Nobody spoke to Ethan that way. Not publicly. Not calmly. Ethan took one measured step forward. You seem very invested for someone who just met her. Sebastian held his gaze without flinching. Some things become obvious quickly. Claire's pulse stumbled hard against her ribs. The words settled into the room with startling intimacy. Ethan heard it too. Claire saw jealousy flash briefly beneath his carefully controlled expression before he masked it again. For the first time since entering the bookstore, Ethan looked uncertain. Truly uncertain. His attention shifted slowly between Claire and Sebastian like he was trying to solve a puzzle he no longer understood. Then Ethan looked directly at Sebastian once more and said carefully, I think I finally know who you are. Sebastian said nothing. That silence alone was answer enough. Ethan exhaled once through his nose, tension visibly tightening across his shoulders. And suddenly Claire understood exactly why he had come tonight. It was never about reconciliation. Ethan had walked into Bellamy Books expecting to reclaim control over a woman he believed would always remain emotionally trapped beneath him. Instead, he found Sebastian Hale standing beside her like a locked door he could not force open. The annual Hale Foundation Winter Auction took place 3 nights later beneath the vaulted glass ceilings of the Astoria Conservatory overlooking the Hudson River. Snow shimmered softly outside the towering windows while Manhattan glowed gold in the distance like another world suspended beyond the storm. Claire stood near the ballroom entrance trying to steady her breathing as guests drifted past, in couture gowns and tailored tuxedos carrying crystal champagne flutes beneath cascading chandeliers. She still could not believe she had agreed to come. Sebastian had invited her 2 days earlier with simple, quiet confidence that somehow made refusing impossible. No pressure, no performance, just a calm question over coffee at the bookstore. Come with me Thursday night. Claire wore a midnight blue gown Nora had practically forced her to buy that afternoon after declaring her closet emotionally traumatized by Ethan Cole. The silk dress fit elegantly without trying too hard, the deep sapphire color making her eyes appear brighter beneath the ballroom lights. For the first time in years, Claire had chosen clothing because she liked it rather than because someone else approved of it. That realization alone felt strangely emotional. The ballroom hummed with wealth and influence. CEOs, politicians, investors, art collectors, the kind of people Ethan spent his entire career trying to impress. Claire spotted him almost immediately near the center of the room beside his fiancée. Ethan looked immaculate in a black tuxedo, every inch the polished corporate attorney Manhattan society admired. But the moment his eyes landed on Claire, his expression changed completely. Shock flickered across his face first, then something sharper. Possessive disbelief. Claire felt her pulse quicken automatically. Old instincts still lingered too deep beneath her skin. Before anxiety could fully tighten around her chest, a familiar calm voice spoke quietly beside her. You look like you are preparing for battle. Claire turned. Sebastian stood there wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo beneath the warm chandelier glow, silver cufflinks catching flashes of light every time he moved. He looked devastatingly composed, as though the entire ballroom naturally bent around him without effort. Yet his attention focused entirely on Claire. Not the politicians greeting him nearby, not the investors waiting to speak with him. Her. I might be, she admitted softly. Sebastian's gaze drifted briefly toward Ethan across the ballroom before returning to her face. Then you should know something. Claire swallowed lightly. What? His expression softened almost imperceptibly. You are not walking in there alone. The words settled deep inside her chest before she could stop them. Sebastian offered his arm calmly, giving her the choice instead of assuming it. That small detail affected her more than it should have. Claire slipped her hand gently through his arm. Warmth grounded her instantly. Together, they entered the ballroom. Conversations shifted almost immediately. Claire felt it happen in subtle waves around them. Heads turning. Whispered recognition. The atmosphere changed the moment Sebastian Hale walked fully into the room. Ethan noticed too. Claire saw his posture tighten from across the ballroom as guests instinctively moved toward Sebastian with polished smiles and eager greetings. Powerful men who barely acknowledged anyone else suddenly stepped aside for him. Women who ignored entire crowds leaned closer whenever he spoke. And through all of it, Sebastian remained calm beside Claire as though none of it impressed him anymore. A sharply dressed woman approached the stage moments later, tapping lightly against the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced warmly, thank you for joining us tonight in support of the Hale Foundation Winter Initiatives. Applause rippled through the ballroom. Claire felt Ethan's eyes fixed on her from across the room. The woman on stage smiled toward Sebastian. And of course, none of this would exist without the vision of our founder and chairman, Mr. Sebastian Hale. The entire ballroom applauded louder now. Claire's breath caught slightly, even though she already knew who he was. Hearing the room react to him like that felt different somehow. Bigger, more real. Sebastian leaned down slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. This is the part where I usually escape. Claire laughed softly before she could stop herself. Several nearby guests immediately turned toward them, startled by the sound. Ethan saw it too. He saw Claire smiling beside Sebastian Hale beneath crystal chandeliers, while some of the most powerful people in Manhattan waited for Sebastian to speak. And for the first time since their divorce, Ethan finally understood something that made cold panic settle quietly into his chest. Claire Bennett was no longer standing beneath him looking upward. She was standing beside a man Ethan could never compete with. The auction ended just after 10 o'clock beneath a storm of applause and flashing camera lights, as donors pledged millions toward the Hale Foundation initiatives. Claire stood near the edge of the ballroom, watching Sebastian speak with city officials and investors beside the stage. Even surrounded by some of the most influential people in Manhattan, he remained entirely himself. Calm, reserved, unshaken by attention that would have intoxicated men like Ethan within seconds. Claire found herself studying him more openly now. The quiet confidence. The way he listened carefully when others spoke instead of waiting impatiently for his turn. The subtle kindness beneath all the power. Ethan had spent years teaching Claire that powerful men needed admiration above all else. Sebastian Hale seemed almost uncomfortable with it. You look very impressed. Claire turned sharply at the sound of Ethan's voice beside her. Her stomach tightened immediately. He stood holding a champagne glass untouched in one hand while snow drifted silently beyond the ballroom windows behind him. His fiancée was nowhere in sight. Claire instinctively glanced across the room toward Sebastian, but he was still speaking with several Foundation board members near the stage. Ethan followed her gaze. Relax, he said softly. I am not here to cause a scene. Claire folded her arms lightly. Then why are you here? Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, and for the first time in years, she noticed exhaustion beneath his polished appearance. Real exhaustion. Because I think I made a mistake. Claire stared at him without responding. Ethan stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice beneath the hum of the ballroom crowd. I have been trying to understand what happened to us. Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of it. What happened to us? As though their marriage had collapsed mysteriously on its own instead of through years of careful emotional erosion. Ethan continued before she could answer. Seeing you with him. He glanced briefly toward Sebastian again. You are different. Claire's throat tightened unexpectedly. Not because his words moved her. Because 6 months ago she would have desperately needed to hear them. Ethan studied her face carefully, searching for weakness he used to know how to reach so easily. You used to look at me like I was your whole world, he said quietly. Claire felt something inside her finally settle with painful clarity. Used to. That woman no longer existed. That was the problem, she answered softly. Ethan blinked. Claire surprised herself with how calm she suddenly felt. No shaking hands. No racing pulse. Just clarity. I made you my entire world, she continued. And somewhere along the way I disappeared inside it. Ethan's jaw tightened faintly. Claire, I never wanted to hurt you. She looked at him carefully beneath the warm ballroom lights, and for the first time she truly saw him without fear distorting the image. Ethan Cole was handsome, intelligent, successful, but beneath all of it lived a man terrified of losing admiration because admiration was the only thing that convinced him he mattered. Suddenly she felt tired instead of heartbroken. You did hurt me, she said quietly. Not all at once. Just slowly enough that I kept blaming myself for it. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Claire shook her head gently before he could. Do you know what the strangest part is? She asked. The night we divorced, I thought nobody would ever look at me again without disappointment. Ethan's expression shifted slightly. Claire. And then a stranger did. Silence stretched heavily between them. Across the ballroom, Sebastian looked up at that exact moment as though sensing something had changed. His gray eyes found Claire immediately through the crowd. Not possessive, not demanding, simply present, steady. Ethan followed her gaze again, and this time Claire saw the truth finally land fully inside him. It was not jealousy over Sebastian's money or power that unsettled Ethan most. It was the realization that Claire no longer looked emotionally trapped beside him. She looked safe somewhere else. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again, quieter now. Do you love him? Claire's breath caught softly in her chest. The answer should have terrified her. Instead it felt startlingly simple. She looked across the ballroom at Sebastian Hale, standing beneath crystal chandeliers, while Manhattan glowed silver behind him through the snowstorm outside. Then she smiled faintly and said, I think I finally remember what it feels like to love myself. The gala began emptying slowly after midnight as Manhattan disappeared beneath thick, falling snow outside the conservatory windows. Guests drifted toward waiting black cars and glowing city streets, while waiters cleared champagne glasses beneath fading orchestra music. Claire stood alone near the balcony doors for a moment, breathing in the quiet after the storm of the evening. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass beside the snowy skyline. She barely recognized the woman staring back anymore. Not because she looked different, because she no longer looked afraid. The ballroom doors opened softly behind her. Claire did not need to turn around to know it was Sebastian. Somehow she had already learned the quiet rhythm of his presence. Calm, unhurried, certain. He stopped beside her near the balcony windows, his tuxedo jacket still perfectly fitted despite hours of conversations, speeches, and cameras. Outside, snowflakes drifted over the Hudson River beneath Silver City lights. "You disappeared," Sebastian said softly. Claire smiled faintly. "I needed a minute to think." Sebastian nodded once as though he understood completely. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. The silence between them had become something warm now instead of uncertain. Claire looked down at the ballroom below, where workers were beginning to dim chandeliers one section at a time. "Ethan talked to me." Sebastian's expression remained unreadable, but his attention sharpened slightly. "Do you want me to be concerned?" Claire laughed quietly under her breath. No. The answer came easier than she expected. True closure, she realized, did not arrive through dramatic confrontations. It arrived quietly, in moments where fear simply stopped controlling you. Sebastian studied her face carefully. "You seem lighter tonight." Claire looked back out toward the snowstorm blanketing Manhattan in white silence. "I think I finally stopped mourning the version of myself he destroyed." The words surprised even her once they were spoken aloud. For years Claire believed healing meant becoming the woman she used to be before Ethan damaged her confidence piece by piece. But standing here now beside Sebastian Hale, she understood something different. She was never meant to return to who she had been. She was meant to become someone stronger. Someone who no longer apologized for taking up space. Sebastian leaned one shoulder lightly against the balcony wall beside her. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "I do not think he destroyed you." Claire looked up at him. Sebastian's gray eyes held hers steadily beneath the soft ballroom lights. "I think he underestimated how much of you survived anyway." Her chest tightened painfully around the truth in his words. Ethan had spent years convincing her she was fragile, difficult, too emotional. Yet somehow she survived the humiliation, the loneliness, the divorce, and all the quiet damage in between. And somehow, against all logic, she still remained capable of warmth, of trust, of standing here beside another man without fear swallowing her whole. Sebastian reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Claire frowned softly as he handed it to her. She unfolded it carefully and blinked in surprise. It was one of her old watercolor sketches, a tiny winter street scene she had painted years ago and almost forgotten about entirely. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Sebastian's expression softened slightly. "You left it inside a used book 2 weeks ago." Claire stared down at the faded watercolor in disbelief. "You kept it?" "Of course I kept it." His answer came so simply that emotion caught unexpectedly in her throat. Ethan had spent years dismissing her art as childish decoration. Sebastian had quietly carried one of her forgotten paintings folded inside his jacket pocket. The contrast nearly shattered her. Snow continued falling heavily outside, while the final chandeliers dimmed across the ballroom behind them. Sebastian glanced down toward the watercolor still in her hands. "You should start painting again." Claire looked up slowly. "Maybe I will." Sebastian smiled faintly then, the kind of rare, quiet smile that always felt more intimate because he gave it so carefully. "Good," he said softly. "The world already has enough people pretending to be someone else." Claire felt tears threaten briefly behind her eyes. But this time, they did not come from sadness. They came from the terrifying realization that healing sometimes arrived disguised as a stranger in a crowded ballroom. A stranger who saw her clearly before she remembered how to see herself. Sebastian offered her his hand then, simple and steady beneath the fading lights of the conservatory. Claire looked at it for only a second before placing her hand in his. Warmth closed gently around her fingers. Outside, Manhattan disappeared beneath snowfall, while somewhere deep inside her chest, the last fragile piece of fear finally let go.